The crack of a gunshot echoed through the canyon as Abigail Bennett pressed her back against the red sandstone wall, her heart pounding with the rhythm of distant hoofbeats. Her fingers clutched the worn leather map that had been her father's final gift, its edges frayed from the years she'd spent memorizing every creek and cavern of the Arizona Territory. It was 1878, and the promise of silver had drawn both fortune-seekers and desperate men to these unforgiving landsmen like the ones who now pursued her through the maze of rock formations. She knew better than the lines on her own palm. Abigail's amber eyes scanned the horizon, calculating her next move. The ambushers would expect her to follow the main trail, but she knew a hidden path that cut through the narrow gully to her right. Her knowledge of this land had kept her alive for 22 years. Today it would have to save someone else. The wounded stranger she'd found half-conscious by Eagle Creek 2 days ago needed a doctor, and fast. The bullet wound in his shoulder had begun to fester, despite her careful tending with desert marigold and yucca root poultices. His fevered muttering had revealed little beyond his name, James Blackwell, and that he carried information that powerful men wanted buried along with him. Abigail slipped through the narrow passage between towering rock walls, her worn boots finding secure footholds in the familiar terrain. The man who called himself Blackwell was hidden in a cave less than a mile ahead. If she could reach him before the gang of riders discovered their trail, they might both survive another day in this beautiful, merciless landscape. The Arizona sun beat down relentlessly as Abigail moved through the shadows of the canyon, her tattered skirt catching on the occasional scrub brush. The water canteen at her hip was nearly empty, a dangerous situation in these parts, but she'd had no time to refill it at the spring when she'd spotted the riders cresting the eastern ridge. She recognized their leader, Silas Morrow, a man whose cattle empire was built on theft and murder. If Morrow was hunting Blackwell personally, whatever information the wounded man carried must be incredibly valuable or incredibly damaging. Reaching the concealed entrance to the cave, Abigail dropped to her knees and crawled inside. The cool darkness enveloped her as she made her way to where James lay on a makeshift bed of blankets. "They're coming," she whispered, touching his forehead. His skin burned beneath her fingertips. "We need to move." James Blackwell opened his eyes, piercing blue even in the dim light of the cave. "How many?" he asked, his voice hoarse from thirst and fever. "5, maybe 6. Morrow's leading them." Abigail helped him to a sitting position, noting the grimace of pain he tried to hide. "There's another way out of these canyons, a path the Apache showed my father years ago. But you'll have to trust me completely." James studied her face, his gaze surprisingly sharp despite his condition. "Why are you helping me, Miss Bennett? You don't know me from Adam." "My father believed everyone deserves a fair chance," she replied, securing her canteen to her belt. "Even strangers with bullet holes in their shoulders who won't say who shot them or why." A ghost of a smile touched his cracked lips. "Fair enough." He struggled to his feet, leaning heavily against the cave wall. "Lead the way, then. I'll try not to slow you down too much." Abigail nodded, peering cautiously out of the cave entrance before motioning him forward. "Stay close. The path isn't obvious unless you know what you're looking for." They emerged into the harsh sunlight, James squinting against the sudden brightness. Abigail guided him toward what appeared to be a solid rock face but revealed itself, as they drew closer, to be the entrance to a narrow cleft in the stone. "This will take us behind the ridge," she explained softly. "From there, we can make our way to a spring I know. You need water and rest before we can attempt the journey to town." James nodded, breathing heavily from even this small exertion. "You know this land well." "I was born here," she replied simply. "My father was a surveyor, After my mother died, he took me everywhere with him. Said I had the best education a girl could get, learning the land directly from it. They moved in silence for several minutes, the passage so narrow in places that they had to turn sideways to squeeze through. Abigail kept one hand on the rock wall, the other ready to steady James if he stumbled. The sound of their pursuers had faded, but she knew Morrow wasn't a man to give up easily. As they emerged from the cleft onto a small ledge overlooking a vast expanse of desert and distant mountains, James paused, his breathing labored. "We should rest," Abigail suggested, noting the pallor of his face, "just for a moment." James slid down against a boulder, closing his eyes briefly. "How far to this spring?" "About 2 miles, but it's mostly downhill from here." Abigail crouched beside him, unscrewing her canteen. "Take the last of the water. You need it more than I do." He shook his head. "We share it. I won't have your death on my conscience, too." The two hung in the air between them, but Abigail didn't press. Instead, she handed him the canteen, watching as he took a careful sip before passing it back to her. She allowed herself just enough to wet her lips before securing it again. "What's your real name?" she asked suddenly. "I know it's not Blackwell." Surprise flickered across his face. "What makes you say that? You hesitate every time I call you by it, and you keep your handkerchief tucked away, even though it would be useful for your fever. I'm guessing it's monogrammed with your actual initials." James, or whoever he was, studied her with newfound respect. "You're observant." "I observe what keeps me alive," she replied without pride. "So," he sighed, seeming to make a decision. "Bradford, James Bradford. I'm a federal marshal." Abigail nodded, unsurprised. "The papers you're protecting, their evidence against Morrow." "Evidence against half the territorial officials who have been taking bribes to look the other way while Morrow expands his empire. Land deeds, financial records, witness testimonies." James winced as he shifted position. "If I can get these papers to Judge Wilson in Tucson, Morrow and his political allies will face justice." "If we can get you there alive," Abigail amended, rising to her feet. "We should keep moving. The spring isn't far and we can rest properly there." She helped him stand, noticing how he swayed slightly before finding his balance. His skin was hot to the touch, the infection worsening despite her herbal treatments. Without proper medical attention, James Bradford wouldn't survive long enough to testify against anyone. They continued their journey, descending carefully down a path visible only to Abigail's trained eye. The landscape shifted from red rock to scattered juniper and pinyon pine as they lost elevation. James grew increasingly silent, focusing all his energy on placing one foot in front of the other. When they finally reached the spring, a small oasis nestled in a protected hollow, James sank to the ground, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. Abigail wasted no time, refilling their canteen and helping James drink. She then unwrapped the bandage on his shoulder, grimacing at the angry red flesh beneath. "It's getting worse," he observed, his voice steady despite the pain she knew he must be feeling. "I need to clean it better," she said, tearing a strip from her petticoat. "This will hurt." James nodded, bracing himself. As Abigail worked to clean the wound with the fresh spring water, he spoke through gritted teeth, clearly trying to distract himself. "What about you, Miss Bennett? What's your story? A young woman alone in this wilderness isn't common." "I wasn't always alone," she replied, her hands steady as she worked. "My father and I lived in a small cabin near what became Morrow's ranch. When silver was discovered in the hills, Morrow decided he wanted our land too. My father refused to sell." She paused, memories darkening her expression. "There was a fire. They said it was an accident, but—" "I'm sorry," James said quietly. "It was 3 years ago. I've been surviving on odd jobs, guiding occasional travelers who need someone who knows the land. Abigail finished bandaging his shoulder with the clean cloth. The irony is that my father was right. There was no silver on our land. Morrow destroyed our home for nothing. James reached out, his hand covering hers for a brief moment. When we get to Tucson, your testimony about the fire could help build the case against him. If we get to Tucson, she corrected, though the warmth of his touch lingered even after he withdrew his hand. They rested by the spring until the worst heat of the day had passed, Abigail gathering what edible plants she could find to supplement their meager supplies. James slept fitfully, his fever rising and falling. When he was awake, he spoke of his life as a marshal, of growing up in Boston, of his decision to come west after the war. Abigail found herself sharing stories of her own childhood, of lessons learned from both her scholarly father and the native peoples who had befriended him. As the sun began its descent, Abigail made a decision. We can't stay here. Morrow knows these canyons too, just not as well as I do. He'll find this spring eventually, James nodded, struggling to his feet with her assistance. Which way? Abigail pointed southwest. There's a small settlement about 8 miles from here, Mesa Verde. It's not much, but they have a doctor of sorts, a former army surgeon who drinks too much but knows his business. 8 miles, James repeated, visibly gathering his strength. Lead on, Miss Bennett. They set off as the day's heat began to fade, moving at a pace that James could maintain. Abigail kept them to the shadows, avoiding open ground where they might be spotted. The terrain grew more forgiving as they left the red rock canyons behind, transitioning to rolling hills dotted with mesquite and cactus. As twilight deepened into night, the temperature dropped sharply, a blessing after the day's heat but dangerous in its own way. Abigail knew the desert could kill with cold as easily as with heat. We should stop, she suggested as James stumbled for the third time in as many minutes. You need rest, and we can't risk breaking an ankle in the dark. They found shelter beneath an overhanging rock formation. Abigail gathered what dry brush she could find, building a small, nearly smokeless fire for warmth. The dancing flames illuminated James's face, the angles of his cheekbones sharpened by fever and exhaustion. You should have left me, he said suddenly. You'd be safer. Safer, maybe, but I wouldn't be able to live with myself. Abigail settled beside him, close enough to share warmth without touching. My father always said character is what you do when no one's watching. Your father sounds like a wise man. He was, too honest for his own good, though. She stared into the small fire. Like you, perhaps. James smiled faintly. Is honesty such a terrible quality in this territory? It can get you killed. Abigail drew her knees up to her chest. But I suppose some things are worth dying for. Justice, James said quietly. Truth. Abigail nodded, though her expression remained skeptical. Big words. I've seen precious little of either in my life. That's why I became a marshal, James explained, his eyes reflecting the firelight. To bring both to places that have neither. They fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts as the night deepened around them. Abigail took first watch, letting James sleep as his body fought the infection. When she gently woke him for his turn, their fingers brushed, and something unspoken passed between them, a connection forming in this shared danger that neither had anticipated. The night passed without incident, and they resumed their journey at first light. James seemed marginally stronger after the rest, though Abigail noticed how he favored his injured side. They traveled steadily through the morning, stopping only briefly when the sun reached its zenith. Tell me about Mesa Verde, James requested as they shared the last of their jerky. What can we expect there? It's a mining town that's seen better days, Abigail explained, scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. The silver vein they were following played out 2 years ago. Some folks left, others stayed on, scraping by however they could. They're suspicious of strangers, but Dr. Harrison treats anyone who can pay and some who can't. "And how will we pay him?" James asked practically. Abigail hesitated. "I have a small brooch that belonged to my mother. I've kept it for emergencies." James shook his head firmly. "No, we'll find another way." "There is no other way," she replied. "Unless you're hiding a fortune in that boot of yours." Before he could respond, Abigail froze, her head tilted as she listened intently. James immediately fell silent, following her gaze toward the ridge they had descended hours earlier. "Riders," she whispered. "3 of them, coming fast." Without another word, they gathered their few possessions and moved quickly toward a cluster of boulders that offered concealment. Crouching behind the largest stone, they watched as the distant figures drew closer. "Morrow?" James asked softly. Abigail nodded, her expression grim. "He must have found our trail at the spring. How far to Mesa Verde from here? 4 miles, maybe less. But we'd be exposed for most of the way." She chewed her lower lip, considering their options. "There's another route. Longer, but it follows a dry creek bed. We'd be harder to spot." James studied the approaching riders, then the open terrain between their hiding place and the settlement that represented their best hope for survival. "You go," he said suddenly. "Follow the creek bed. I'll head straight across, draw them after me." "That's suicide," Abigail objected immediately. "It's strategy," he countered. "I'm the one they want. You can make it to Mesa Verde, bring back help." "Absolutely not. You wouldn't last an hour in your condition." Abigail's tone brooked no argument. "We stay together." James looked as if he might protest further, but another glance at the approaching riders changed his mind. "The creek bed, then. Quickly." They slipped from their hiding place, keeping low as they made their way toward the depression in the landscape that marked the seasonal waterway. Once within its protective banks, they moved faster, the high sides shielding them from view. The creek bed twisted and turned, adding distance to their journey but providing vital cover. They traveled in tense silence, each step taking them closer to safety yet draining James's limited reserves. His breathing grew more labored, his steps less certain. When he stumbled and fell to one knee, Abigail was immediately at his side, her arm around his waist to help him rise. "Just a little further," she encouraged, though in truth they still had over 2 miles to go. "You can do this, James." He nodded, leaning on her more heavily than before. "If I don't make it, you will," she interrupted firmly. "If I don't," he persisted, "the papers are sewn into the lining of my vest. Get them to Judge Wilson. Tell him everything you know about Morrow." Abigail nodded reluctantly. "I will. But it won't come to that." They continued their arduous journey, the creek bed gradually shallowing as they approached more settled land. When it became too exposed to follow any longer, they took to a line of mesquite trees that offered minimal cover. The sun was setting when they finally caught sight of Mesa Verde, a cluster of weathered buildings silhouetted against the darkening sky. Smoke rose from a few chimneys, and the yellow glow of lanterns was visible in some windows. "We made it," Abigail breathed, relief evident in her voice. James managed a weak smile. "Thanks to you." They approached the town cautiously, alert for any sign that Morrow's men had somehow gotten ahead of them. The main street was quiet, a few horses tethered outside the saloon the only indication of life. "The doctor's place is at the end of the street," Abigail whispered, supporting more of James's weight with each step. "The house with the blue door." They had almost reached it when a shot rang out, the bullet splintering the wooden sidewalk inches from their feet. Abigail jerked James behind the corner of the nearest building as 2 more shots followed in quick succession. "Damn," James muttered, drawing his revolver with shaking hands. They were waiting for us. Abigail peered around the corner, spotting 3 men using the water trough in front of the saloon as cover. One was definitely Silas Morrow, his silver-streaked beard unmistakable even in the fading light. "They're between us and the doctor," she observed grimly. James nodded, his face pale with pain and exhaustion. "We need a diversion." Before Abigail could respond, the blue door at the end of the street opened and a figure stepped out, shotgun in hand. "What in blazes is going on out here?" a gruff voice demanded. "This is a respectable town." "Take your feuding elsewhere." Morrow fired in the doctor's direction, forcing the man back inside. But the momentary distraction was enough for Abigail to formulate a plan. "There's an alley behind these buildings," she whispered. "If we can circle around, we might reach the doctor's house from the back." James nodded, holstering his weapon to save his strength. They slipped down the narrow passage between buildings, navigating through shadows as shouts and occasional gunfire continued in the main street. The back of Mesa Verde was a jumble of outbuildings, clotheslines, and small garden plots. Abigail led them carefully through this maze, heading for the distinctive blue back door that matched the front of the doctor's house. They were halfway there when a figure stepped from behind a shed, revolver aimed directly at them. "Well, well," drawled one of Morrow's men, a thin-faced individual with cold eyes. "Trying to be clever, are we?" James immediately pushed Abigail behind him despite his weakened state. "This doesn't involve her. Let her go," the man laughed. "Everything involves everyone in this business, Marshal. Now hand over those papers and maybe the boss will let you die quick instead of slow." "I don't have them anymore," James lied smoothly. "They're already on their way to Tucson." The man's expression hardened. "You're lying, and now you're both going to die for it." As his finger tightened on the trigger, a shotgun blast shattered the twilight, sending the gunman sprawling face down in the dirt. Behind him stood Dr. Harrison, his weathered face grim as he lowered the smoking weapon. "I told you this was a respectable town," he growled, eyeing James's blood-stained shirt. "You look like you could use my professional services, son." "Yes, sir," James managed, swaying on his feet. "Much obliged." "Get him inside," the doctor directed Abigail. "Back door. I'll keep watch." Together, they half-carried James into the doctor's house, a surprisingly clean and orderly establishment given its owner's reputation for drink. The main room served as both examination area and living quarters, with a wood stove, a table equipped with medical instruments, and various shelves of bottles and bandages. On the table, Dr. Harrison ordered as he bolted the door behind them, "Shirt off." Abigail helped James remove his vest and blood-stained shirt, carefully preserving the lining that contained the crucial documents. As the doctor examined the wound, his experienced hands probing gently, Abigail explained their situation in terse sentences. "Morrow, eh?" The doctor's expression darkened. "That explains the ruckus. He owns the sheriff 2 towns over but doesn't have much influence here. Still, he's not a man to cross lightly." He reached for a bottle of whiskey, pouring some into a glass. "Drink this," he instructed James. "What I'm about to do will hurt like the devil." James downed the liquor without question, grimacing as it burned his throat. The doctor then poured more directly onto the wound, causing James to inhale sharply through clenched teeth. "Bullet's still in there," Harrison observed. "Needs to come out before infection spreads further. You've done well with those herbal poultices," he added to Abigail, "but he needs surgery now." "Whatever it takes," James said, his voice strained. "But we have to worry about Morrow too. He won't give up easily." As if to underscore his point, a volley of gunfire sounded from the street, followed by shouting. The doctor moved to a cabinet, retrieving more shotgun shells. Looks like the town's finally decided to take a stand. Morrow's been squeezing everyone dry for too long. He handed the loaded shotgun to Abigail. Know how to use one of these, she nodded, accepting the weapon with steady hands. My father taught me. Good girl. Watch the back door while I work. If anyone tries to come through who isn't me, shoot first and ask questions never. Abigail positioned herself by the window, the shotgun ready as Dr. Harrison began the delicate process of extracting the bullet from James's shoulder. The sounds of the firefight outside continued sporadically, but no one approached the back of the house. It took the doctor nearly an hour to remove the bullet, clean the wound thoroughly, and stitch it closed. By the time he finished, James was pale and sweating but conscious, his blue eyes clear for the first time since Abigail had found him. You'll live, Harrison pronounced, washing his hands in a basin. Provided you rest that arm and don't do anything foolish for at least a week. The gunfire outside had ceased some time ago, replaced by an ominous silence that made Abigail increasingly nervous. What do you think happened? She asked, still vigilant at her post. Before the doctor could respond, a knock sounded at the front door, 3 quick raps followed by 2 slower ones. Harrison relaxed visibly. That's Sheriff Davis. Sounds like it's over. He opened the door to reveal a stocky man with a graying mustache and a star pinned to his vest. Behind him stood several townsmen, rifles in hand. Got him cornered at the saloon, Davis reported. Morrow and one of his boys. The other 2 are dead. Any casualties on our side? Harrison asked, already reaching for his medical bag. Jenkins took one in the arm, nothing serious. Thompson caught a graze across his ribs. The sheriff's gaze moved to James, who was now sitting up on the edge of the table. This the federal marshal they were after, James nodded weakly. James Bradford. I have evidence that could put Morrow away for good. Then you'd better get well quick, Davis replied, because I can only hold him so long without charges. Over the next 3 days, Mesa Verde transformed from a dying mining town to a hub of activity. Telegrams flew back and forth to Tucson, and a detachment of soldiers arrived to escort Morrow and his surviving henchmen to face justice. James, still weak but improving rapidly under Dr. Harrison's care, provided the evidence that would ensure Silas Morrow never again threatened anyone in the Arizona territory. Abigail remained by his side throughout, her knowledge of herbal remedies complementing the doctor's more conventional treatments. Each day brought visible improvement in James's condition, and a deepening of the connection between them. On the 4th evening, as they sat on the doctor's small back porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson, James finally asked the question that had been on his mind. What will you do now, Miss Bennett? Abigail shrugged, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. I haven't thought that far ahead. Go back to guiding, I suppose. It's what I know. James was silent for a moment, his hand finding hers on the rough wooden bench. There's another option, he said carefully. Come to Tucson with me. Your testimony about your father's death will strengthen the case against Morrow and afterward. He paused, suddenly less certain of himself than when facing armed criminals. Afterward, perhaps we could see where this leads. Abigail turned to him, surprise and something warmer in her amber eyes. This connection between us, he clarified, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. I'm not a man who believes in fate, Abigail, but meeting you, having my life saved by you, feels like more than simple chance. A smile curved her lips, the first true smile he had seen from her. For a lawman, you have a poetic streak, Marshal Bradford. Only when inspired, he replied, returning her smile with one of his own. They sat in companionable silence as the last rays of sun faded from the sky, the first stars appearing overhead. The decision before Abigail was significant to leave the only home she had ever known, to trust in a future with a man she had known for less than a week. And yet, as she felt the strength of his hand holding hers, she realized that some decisions were made not by logic but by the heart. "Yes," she said simply, "I'll come to Tucson." The journey to Tucson took 4 days by stagecoach, with James growing stronger with each passing mile. They traveled with an escort of soldiers, the precious documents secure in a locked case handcuffed to James's wrist. Abigail watched the landscape change from the familiar red rocks of her home to the rolling grasslands that surrounded Tucson, a mixture of apprehension and excitement filling her at the prospect of this new chapter in her life. Tucson in 1878 was a bustling frontier town, a mix of adobe buildings and newer wooden structures, its streets filled with a diverse population of settlers, soldiers, and indigenous peoples. After the isolation of the canyons where Abigail had spent most of her life, the city seemed overwhelming in its noise and activity. They were met at the stagecoach station by a court representative who escorted them directly to the territorial courthouse, where Judge Wilson awaited the evidence that would break Morrow's power in the region. Abigail remained by James's side throughout the long hours of statements and depositions, her clear, factual account of her father's death adding a human dimension to the case that the financial documents alone could not provide. When it was over, when Morrow had been formally charged with multiple counts of fraud, bribery, and murder, James and Abigail emerged from the courthouse into the warm Arizona evening, both exhausted but relieved. "It's done," James said, his voice reflecting the weight that had been lifted from his shoulders. "He'll never hurt anyone again." Abigail nodded, though her expression remained somber. "Justice for my father, finally, though it doesn't bring him back." James took her hand, his touch gentle yet reassuring. "No, it doesn't, but it honors his memory and protects others from suffering the same fate." They walked in silence through the streets of Tucson, eventually finding themselves in a small plaza where a local band was playing lively music. Couples danced in the gathering twilight, their movements carefree in a way that seemed foreign to both James and Abigail after their recent ordeal. "Would you care to dance, Miss Bennett?" James asked formally, a hint of shyness in his usually confident demeanor. Abigail looked down at her travel-worn dress, then at the more elegantly attired ladies twirling in their partners' arms. "I'm hardly dressed for it," she demurred. "You're the most beautiful woman here," James replied with such simple honesty that Abigail felt a blush rise to her cheeks. Before she could respond, a commotion at the edge of the plaza caught their attention. A thin woman with hollow cheeks was being forcibly removed from a restaurant, her protests that she had money to pay falling on deaf ears. "Please," they heard her beg, "I haven't eaten in 2 days." "I can pay, I swear." The restaurant owner, a corpulent man with an unfriendly face, crossed his arms over his chest. "With what? Promises? Get out of here before I call the law on you for vagrancy." James stepped forward immediately, his sense of justice offended by the scene. "What seems to be the problem here?" The restaurant owner eyed James's well-worn but respectable attire with slightly more deference than he had shown the woman. "No problem, sir. Just removing an unwelcome beggar." "I'm not a beggar," the woman insisted, her dignity intact despite her obvious hunger. "I have money, or I will have once the bank opens tomorrow. My late husband's account, I've heard that tale before," the owner interrupted dismissively. "Come back when you have real currency." James glanced at Abigail, who nodded her understanding without words needed. He turned back to the restaurant owner, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used in his professional capacity. "This woman will be dining as my guest this evening," he stated, leaving no room for argument. "I trust that won't be a problem." The owner's demeanor changed immediately at the prospect of a paying customer. "Of course not, sir. Please come in." The thin woman stared at James with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. "Why would you help a stranger?" "Because I've been hungry before," he replied simply. "And because a very wise woman recently taught me that character is what you do when no one is watching." He gestured to Abigail, who stepped forward with a warm smile. "Please join us, Mrs. Davis, Eleanor Davis." The woman straightened her threadbare shawl with as much dignity as a queen might adjust her ermine cloak. "And I assure you, I can repay your kindness once the bank opens. My husband, God rest his soul, left me a small account." "There's no need for repayment," James assured her as they entered the restaurant and were shown to a table. "Though I am curious about your situation, if you don't mind sharing it." Over a simple but hearty meal, Eleanor Davis told them her story. Her husband, a prospector with modest success, had died of fever 3 months earlier while they were traveling from California. The journey to reach Tucson, where he had deposited their savings in the Territorial Bank, had taken all her remaining resources. She had arrived only that morning, too late for bank business, and with no money for food or lodging until the following day. "Bradford," she repeated when James introduced himself properly. "You wouldn't happen to be related to Jeremiah Bradford of Boston?" James's eyebrows rose in surprise. "He was my uncle. Did you know him?" Eleanor nodded. "He grubstaked my husband's first claim in California, a generous man who believed in giving others a chance. The family resemblance is clear not just in your features but in your actions." As they finished their meal, Abigail noticed James growing thoughtful, his gaze moving from Eleanor to herself and back again. When they stepped back onto the plaza, the music still playing in the evening air, he made a decision. "Mrs. Davis, you mentioned needing lodging for the night. Miss Bennett and I are staying at the Arizona Hotel. Please allow me to secure a room for you as well." "Your kindness is overwhelming," Eleanor began, "but I couldn't possibly—" "I insist," James said firmly. "And tomorrow, perhaps you would consider a business proposition." At the hotel, after ensuring Eleanor was comfortably settled in her room, James explained his thinking to Abigail as they walked in the hotel's small garden. "My uncle left me a modest inheritance," he said, "which I've barely touched since joining the Marshal's service. I've been considering resigning my position to establish a freight business here in the territory. The railroad is coming, but it will be years before it reaches the smaller settlements." "And Mrs. Davis," Abigail prompted, sensing there was more to his plan. "She needs employment, and I need someone with business acumen to manage the office while I'm on the road." James hesitated, then continued more cautiously. "And I was hoping you might consider being part of this venture as well, Abigail. Me, what do I know about freight businesses? You know the territory better than anyone I've ever met. Your knowledge would be invaluable in establishing the most efficient routes, identifying new settlements that need service." Abigail stopped walking, turning to face him directly. "Is this your way of ensuring I stay in Tucson, Marshal Bradford?" James met her gaze steadily. "It's my way of offering you a future that honors your skills while keeping you." He paused, searching for the right words. "Near me." The honesty in his blue eyes touched something in Abigail that had been dormant since her father's death, a sense of belonging, of possibility. "I need time to consider it," she said finally. "Of course," James nodded, disappointment and understanding mingling in his expression. "Take all the time you need." The following morning brought new clarity for Abigail. As she watched James and Eleanor discuss the business proposition over breakfast, She realized that he was offering more than employment. He was offering a chance to build something meaningful, to be part of a community again. "I'll do it," she announced, interrupting their conversation about potential warehouse locations. "I'll help with the freight business." The smile that illuminated James's face was worth any uncertainty she might have felt. "You won't regret it," he promised. "I'll hold you to that," Marshal Bradford. Over the next 6 months, Bradford Freight and Cartage grew from a concept to a thriving business. James resigned from the marshal's service, using his connections and reputation to secure contracts throughout the territory. Alina proved to be a shrewd business manager, her experience as a prospector's wife having taught her much about supply and demand in frontier communities. And Abigail, to her own surprise, discovered that her knowledge of the land translated perfectly to logistics planning. The routes she designed saved time and resources, giving Bradford Freight an edge over its competitors. She took particular satisfaction in creating supply lines to indigenous communities that had previously been neglected by other freight companies. As summer turned to fall and then to winter, the relationship between James and Abigail deepened beyond business partnership. Their shared experiences had forged a bond that grew naturally into love, expressed first in small gestures, a hand offered to help her from a wagon, a cup of coffee prepared exactly as he liked it, and later in more explicit declarations. On Christmas Eve, with Tucson decorated in a mixture of American and Mexican holiday traditions, James asked Abigail to accompany him on a walk through the plaza, now transformed with luminarias and greenery. "I have something for you," he said, producing a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with red string. Abigail unwrapped it carefully to reveal a leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with her initials. "Open it," James encouraged. Inside, she found detailed maps of the Arizona Territory, some printed, others hand-drawn, all annotated with notes about terrain, water sources, and settlements. "It's beautiful," she breathed, running her fingers over the pages. "But I don't understand. These are already in my head." "That's precisely why I had it made," James explained. "Your knowledge is invaluable, Abigail. It should be preserved, passed on to others who will come after us. This territory is changing rapidly, and the wisdom you carry could be lost if it isn't recorded." Abigail stared at him, deeply touched by his understanding of what her connection to the land truly meant. "This is the most thoughtful gift I've ever received." James took her hands in his, the journal cradled between them. "There's something else I'd like to give you if you'll accept it." From his pocket, he withdrew a simple gold ring set with a small but perfect sapphire. "This was my mother's," he said softly. "I've carried it with me everywhere, waiting for the right woman to give it to." Abigail's breath caught as he continued. "You saved my life with your knowledge of the land, Abigail. But you've done more than that. You've shown me what true courage and integrity look like. You've made me want to be worthy of a woman like you." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "Will you marry me?" Tears filled Abigail's eyes as she looked from the ring to the face of the man who had come to mean everything to her. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly, "Yes, I will marry you, James Bradford." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, the church bells of Tucson began to ring, announcing the arrival of Christmas Day, a new beginning in more ways than one. They were married in the spring of 1879, a simple ceremony attended by Alina, Dr. Harrison, who had relocated to Tucson at James's invitation to serve as the company's physician, and a handful of friends they had made in the growing community. Judge Wilson, who had presided over Morrow's trial, performed the ceremony, noting with satisfaction that justice had brought together two people who might never have met otherwise. Bradford Freight and Cartage continued to prosper, expanding its operations throughout the Southwest. When the railroad finally reached Tucson in 1880, James adapted the business to complement rather than compete with the new transportation method, establishing distribution centers at key rail stops that served the still isolated communities beyond the tracks. In the autumn of 1880, Abigail gave birth to their first child, a son they named William after her father. As she held her newborn, James seated beside her on their bed, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from the solitary existence in the canyons to this moment of profound contentment. "What are you thinking?" James asked, his finger captured in his son's tiny but determined grip. "I'm thinking about how knowledge saved us both," she replied, her smile gentle with the wisdom of new motherhood. "My knowledge of the land saved you from Morrow's ambush, and your name, your family connection saved me from a life of isolation and struggle." James leaned forward to kiss her forehead tenderly. "We saved each other, I think. And now, we have this little one to save us from ever becoming too comfortable or complacent." As if in agreement, William let out a lusty cry, causing both parents to laugh. Life in the Arizona Territory would never be easy, but together, they had built something resilient and true, a family and a future as vast and promising as the land itself. By 1885, Bradford Freight and Cartage had become the largest independent freight company in the Arizona Territory, with offices in Tucson, Phoenix, and several smaller settlements. James and Abigail had welcomed a daughter, Emma, to join their son William, and had built a comfortable home on the outskirts of Tucson where the children could grow up with space to explore. Abigail's journal of maps and territorial knowledge had been expanded into a series of guides that the company published and distributed to new settlers, earning her recognition as an authority on the region's geography and natural resources. James had served a term on the Tucson City Council, working to ensure that the rapid development of the territory proceeded with respect for both its natural beauty and its indigenous inhabitants. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their home watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in gold and purple, William and Emma playing with wooden blocks at their feet, James took Abigail's hand in his. "You ever miss it?" he asked. "The solitude, the direct connection to the land that you had before." Abigail considered the question seriously, as was her way. "Sometimes," she admitted. "There was a purity to that existence that can't be replicated in town life." She looked at their children, then at the home they had built together, solid and welcoming against the vast desert sky. "But I wouldn't trade this for anything. The connection I felt to the land then was profound, but it was incomplete without human connection." James nodded, understanding as he always did. "Perhaps we should take the children into the canyons when they're older, teach them what you know." "I'd like that," Abigail smiled, squeezing his hand. "They should understand where they come from, both your Eastern heritage and my Western one." As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, James reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this moment. What had begun with a bullet wound and a desperate flight through the canyons had blossomed into a life richer than either of them could have imagined. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "when I took that bullet and fell from my horse at Eagle Creek, I thought it was the worst day of my life." "And now," Abigail prompted, though she knew the answer. "Now I think it might have been the best," James replied, drawing her close as the first stars appeared overhead, "because it led me to you." In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, a sound that once signaled danger but now reminded them both of the wild beauty that had brought them together, a land of harsh challenges and unexpected blessings, where knowledge had saved lives and a name had offered new beginnings. And as night fell over the Arizona territory, James and Abigail Bradford sat contentedly in the life they had built together, their children safe beside them, their future as vast and promising as the star-filled sky above.